Thanks, Amit. Um, so yes, I'll tell you about the work that we've been doing to scale NAMD on Aurora. And so first, I want to just tell you a little bit about what molecular dynamics is, what it does for us. You can think of it effectively as providing biomedical researchers with a theoretical computational microscope where you can see the atomistic details of interactions between atoms, so you can see on those types of length scales and on, very fine-grained time scales that aren't accessible through experimental techniques. And um, it ends up providing scientific insight that can ultimately lead to improvements in human health. And so, you can think of it as, informing, basic science, about, how the molecular machinery works inside, say, a human cell or with like cell membrane channels, um, or, even informing uh, the development of drug design or, you know, uh, things like that. So let me tell you about some of the high profile simulations we did back in the COVID days. So this is a nice case where we used NAMD to simulate the SARS-CoV-2 virus on TAC Frontiera and on OLCF Summit, which at the time it was the second fastest supercomputer in the world. And so this was the first all atom modeling of the COVID uh, virion. Um, but we also did a lot of modeling of the uh, going all the way down to the details of like the glycan shield conformations, which were, very interesting because, that's, where you understand how uh, COVID infects the cell, what you might be able to do to disrupt these infections. Then simulations of the entire spike, and finally we were able to assemble this entire model and uh, run simulations on NAMD where we scaled it across about 90% of the Summit supercomputer. And uh, and so this was, a really nice effort that we did back in 2020 when we were all working from home during the COVID lockdown. And so this project, which is a collaboration with the Amaro lab at UCSD, they really ran the whole show. But this project ended up winning the Gordon Bell Special Prize at SC20. And involved over a zettaflop of NAMD simulation. So it was really remarkable. And then we turned around the next year and we extended this to something that instead of just a, a 300 million atom simulation, this was a 1 billion atom simulation that we put together with the uh, delta form of SARS-CoV-2 or the delta variant of SARS-CoV-2 that was contained in an aerosol droplet. And so this was really interesting. This effectively gave theoretical evidence that COVID was airborne because, we were able to use this and create a stable simulation out of it. And again, we scaled this across 4,096 nodes of Summit. Um, so NAMD is developed and maintained by the Theoretical and Computational Biophysics Group at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The code is written in C++ with Charm++ parallel objects. And so we use CUDA for supporting NVIDIA devices. We use HIP for AMD devices. And we use oneAPI now, SYCL for Intel devices. And so in NAMD, we're simulating the movements of biomolecules over time. And NAMD was designed from the ground up to be a parallel distributed code. Um, but whenever we're enabling parallel scaling, there's a couple different approaches we can take. For really large systems, we can think of single copy scaling, where we're scaling this system across a number of nodes. And for but if we're looking at a smaller system, we can basically use this as using an enhanced sampling technique where we have multiple copies of the system that we're running across the computer. That this is like a weak scaling case, but this is a way that we can run to enhance the sampling, since trying to uh, sample through time is ultimately the bottleneck that we face in something like NAMD. So, um, just looking at what we're simulating when we do molecular dynamics, we're integrating Newton's equations of motion through time. So this is F equals ma, where the force is F, or the negative gradient of a scalar potential function. And so these contain terms that account for the covalent bonding between atoms. We call these are like spring bonds, and then angles, and dihedrals, which would be, basically like, the rotational motion between two things that define a plane. And then finally, we have these non-bonded force terms as well. And these are really, this is the most computationally intensive part of the force calculation, is calculating these forces that are between all pairs of atoms. And so these include electrostatics, and they include van der Waals. And so commonly we treat the non-bonded terms using a cutoff distance. And so really that part scales uh, linearly with the size of the system, except that we really do need long-range electrostatics. We need to account for that. And so then we use special approximation techniques that scale as big O of n or big O of n log n. Um, so something that ends up being, feasible to calculate, rather than, something that increases quadratically. And so we're integrating these equations for millions of time steps, where the size of the time step is on the order of femtoseconds. And so a femtosecond is 10 to the negative 15 seconds. And so it's really small. We've got to do it requires a billion femtoseconds to cover just a microsecond of simulated time. And then the most computationally intensive part, then, like I said, is this calculation of the non-bonded forces. So, unfortunately, the parallelism for MD simulation is limited to what we can do within each time step, because we have to calculate these time steps sequentially. And so, the workflow looks like, we take particle positions and we calculate the forces between the particles and use those forces to update the positions. And we're looping this process for millions of time steps. And occasionally we're going to output reduced quantities like energy, temperature, and pressure that sort of track the, uh, the quality of the simulation, whether things are good, or whether the simulation has blown up and we need to stop everything. And then also we occasionally output the position coordinates. So we take a snapshot of the trajectory. And so in the movie that you saw on a previous panel, that's really what you were seeing there, was, these trajectory frames being played back as a movie. And so, like I said, the force calculation is the majority of the work, and then updating the positions, that's much smaller amount of work. So we focus on being able to calculate the forces efficiently. And so NAMD parallelizes over not just the spatial domain, but also the interaction space. And so we decompose the atoms into equal volume patches. And since we're, the majority of the work is this non-bonded force calculation that we're, trying to calculate the short range part within a cutoff, we can think of calculating pairwise forces between atoms and between then neighboring patches in space. And so we can decompose these patch-patch interactions as compute objects. And that gives us a lot of work that we can decompose, to run this all in parallel. So, it's not just a spatial decomposition of patches, but then we can move these compute objects around as well. And that really, is the bulk of the computational work that we're doing at each step. And so then for load balancing, we can migrate these compute objects to try and keep all the processors consistently occupied. And so looking at just the workflow that's done over a single time step, what we have is we have um, a multicast operation of the coordinates from the patches to the compute objects. And so then we're computing these forces, and then we have something that looks like a reduction operation then, where we're summing the forces for these atoms based on what we calculate in the compute objects. And so the way we introduce GPUs, the way we incorporate GPUs, is that we offload these really the scalable parts of the force calculation to the GPU. So this includes the non-bonded computes, the bonded computes, and then the scalable parts of the particle mesh Ewald algorithm that's used to approximate long-range electrostatics. And so that's the charge spreading atoms, charges to grid points, and then the force interpolation, where we've calculated the reciprocal space contribution of PME, and we're interpolating the forces from the grid points back to the atoms. And so um, we need to acknowledge that, we've had years of Intel support for NAMD development. That, we've been working on a port for supporting Intel PVC for a few years, but even dating back long before that, we have a really good relationship with Intel, where they've given us a lot of help towards the development that we're doing in NAMD. So, among other things, we've established at TCB Group a oneAPI Academic Center of Excellence. Um, we It was Mike Brown from Intel that developed an AVX 512 accelerated code path that we've used quite successfully on Frontera. Um, and the initial porting of the CUDA force kernels was done by Tarek Mallis. And then our grad student here, Jamin Choi, worked on fixing the PME SYCL kernel implementation with the FFTs to correctly use oneMKL so that we could support that PME calculation on a single GPU for small systems. And so then, for the past a couple of years, we've been working with KU on optimizing the SYCL GPU offload code path. And so here are the current NAMD SYCL developers. And so I'm going to just tell you a little bit about some key contributions here. First, starting with K. So this is um, just a little plotting of all the different work that all the work that he did over, a number of months to optimize our SYCL code path whenever he came onto the project with us. And so he's gotten a total of like 4.5x speed up over the code that we initially had before he started on the project. But the interesting part here are the parts where the graphs dip down, and it kind of serves to show the level of difficulty that, um, trying to accelerate molecular dynamics, poses. And so, you know, his optimization started working on, just optimizing the non-bonded force kernels. And then these dips here are when he enabled something else. And so it's like, okay, he got non-bonded forces, optimized really well. Well, okay, let's turn on PME GPU kernels. All of a sudden, we've got, performance problems again that we've got to, optimize away. And so, and the next problem here, the next step in the graph was whenever we were trying to enable the code that we already had in place for, running on CUDA devices. And this was, a fast mechanism to be able to transfer the force calculation back to the CPU-based patches. So from device to host memory, we had a sort of a fast mechanism in place. But then we had to basically optimize away the some of the synchronization overheads and the other sources of latency here that was hindering performance. Ultimately, though, he was able to get all of this to work. And so here's a plot then of our performance scaling on Sunspot using a test system of 1 million atoms. And the way we're running this successfully is to basically run one process or rank per GPU compute tile. And so that means that we've got 6 GPUs per node, but there's 2 compute tiles per GPU. So that's 12 processes per node that this is the optimal way to run NAMD on uh, Aurora. Well, and Sunspot is, uh, basically that was the pre-machine to Aurora. And so here, it was Eric Bohm, who is also a senior research programmer here in the research group. Um, and Eric has a lot of experience with Charm++. He's been one of the key Charm++ developers for years. And so this was, the big contribution here was basically getting the Charm++ uh, built with OFI, low-level runtime support on, Sunspot and Aurora. And I haven't told you much about Charm++ yet, but Charm++ is the parallel framework that NAMD uses. It's an asynchronous message-driven uh, programming framework. And so instead of being a message passing interface like MPI, this, allows us to do a lot better overlapping of communication and computation. And so when you get the low-level runtime support in Charm++ working well on a parallel computer like Aurora, you generally get, faster um, performance, higher performance than you do with uh, Charm++ built directly on MPI, and then using um, you know, the message passing interface directly that way. And so here in this plot, this is kind of characteristic of all the plots that I show. The performance is measured in the number of simulated nanoseconds per day. And, so performance versus the number of nodes. And so we see this leveling out of, our scaling, which, makes sense when you consider that this is a strong scaling result. We're not increasing the amount of work per node. And so, at the upper end, we're, you know, only looking at, around 1,000 atoms or so per uh, per rank. And so, it's getting pretty thin as far as the amount of work goes. So now we've also been working with Jiang at Argonne. And so this is, taking the OFI build of NAMD, and then Wei put together a synthetic benchmark. And so, you know, this is where you take a periodic system like STMV, and since it's periodic, you can take advantage of periodicity, and you can, create a synthetic benchmark where you've tiled space with copies of STMV, 5 by 5 by 5 by 4, 100 copies of STMV. So a benchmark that's a little over 100 million atoms. And so here he's again, scaling this now out to 2048 nodes of Aurora. And so we're getting decent, strong scaling now with our NAMD SYCL build. And another way that we tested this was with weak scaling on Aurora. And so this is an example of a small system, 70,000 atoms. And he's using a protocol called replica exchange solute scaling, or REST-2. And so the idea with this is that, you've got these weakly coupled systems that are each running for 500 steps before they exchange a scaling value, and you're only doing exchanges with your nearest neighbor. And so you would expect really good, you know, scaling on this. Here we're just showing perfect scaling here across 2048 nodes. Well, but the direction that we could take this is, of course, we could make the performance per uh, system, per simulated system, a lot faster. And that's what we've already done, on with our NVIDIA support. The release of NAMD 3 last summer introduced a GPU resident approach. And so, you know, with GPU offload, you're using the GPU as a coprocessor where it really doesn't know anything about the simulation. You're basically just sending it positions, the host is sending it positions at each time step, and the GPU calculates forces and sends it back. And the problem is that as GPUs have gotten faster over the years, it's uh, it's really hard with this type of mechanism to keep the GPUs fully occupied. The performance becomes bottlenecked due to the work that's being done on the CPU at each step. And so with GPU resident implementation, we move all of the work to the GPUs. The GPU maintains the positions between time steps and also does all of the numerical integration calculations for each time step. And so we're expecting that once we get this implemented in SYCL, this is going to give us like a 2.5x performance improvement. That's what we've seen for our performance on CUDA. And so, that would allow us on the previous slide to, instead of, be doing, you know, 80, what was I looking at? 80 nanoseconds per day simulation. We'd be looking at something more like 200 nanoseconds a day simulation with a GPU resident implementation. So I'll leave you with just like a little anecdote here uh, of, some of the problems we've run into, but this is both amusing and frustrating at the same time. Sometimes when you're porting codes to SYCL, it's easy to get tripped up by the little things. And so one question we were asking ourselves recently is why were we getting the wrong answer when we enabled PME? Well, the answer was that we were using a SYCL float 3 structure that is a padded structure. And when we were just, blindly, you know, relabeling this and trying to use this like we kind of use our CUDA data structure, but we were using, something without a padding, well, we ended up, getting erroneous results. So, um, so by adding the pad, it's great when you have a bug that just is fixed with just one little line of code, but that's sometimes what we encounter, and anyway, there's a thousand things that can trip you up, and this is just one of them here. So finally, I need to acknowledge our funding sources, and also the great help that we've been provided by uh, TAC, by Intel, by Argonne. So thanks, and I'm ready to take questions.
David, are there any questions from the attendees? I have one question to you on slide number 12. Were
Sure.
the experiments single node or multi-node?
This was all single tile, actually.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And this GPU resident code, you're porting it to the Intel GPUs right now, right? It's under progress.
Um, yes. So right now, this is the work that we're actually doing right now, is porting the GPU resident code path to SYCL.